Hey, it's Susan and welcome to this video. In this video, you're going to watch me do the wash part of this ink and wash painting. So ink and wash, if you don't know what that is basically just ink lines with a watercolor wash. It's a type of style and it's often done in urban sketching. People who travel and sketch on location will do this style in sketchbooks, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has to stay in a sketchbook. So here I'm doing it on a piece of paper. I actually am painting this for a lesson and also as part of my process for just the free challenge that I host every month. So it's called the Paint With Me Challenge, and the photo is picked for not only our free challenge but also for our community. So the members of my community are painting this month, meaning March, and they're getting basically videos that are guided for this process. So if you're not a member of the community, you can always participate in these paintings as well, just by downloading the reference photo, painting along, and if you're on Instagram, you can share it there with me. So basically, I'm just doing the wash part here. I've already done the sketch. I always do a pencil sketch. So if you're curious, there was a pencil sketch, and then I do the ink lines, and then I'll erase some of the pencil lines. So you can see some of the pencil lines are still there. They don't bother me. I think a lot of people, ask or wonder about, do pencil lines show up under watercolor? And they do, especially if you're not painting very dark, but they don't bother me. But if they bother you, you can always erase them, especially in something like an ink and wash like this, because you have the ink lines and you can just erase all the pencil lines if you want to. So I really love this style because I feel like it helps the watercolors feel like it's a lot less pressure. So it takes a lot of the pressure off of the watercolor part of it, because your watercolors become almost, it's not so much a supporting element, but it definitely has help. So the ink lines help create the structure of the painting, so you don't have to be worrying about as much about borders and definitions of edges, because you have a lot of the ink lines drawn in to help you define those areas. So you know that it's a door already. And, I sort of think about it as a coloring book, but not as simple as a coloring book, because not all of your details are done in ink lines. At least that's not the way I approach it. I tend to do the ink lines and leave out some of the details. So for example, here you can see that the foliage, I haven't drawn out where all of the flowers are going to be. I haven't drawn out any of the interior parts of the green areas. So it's not like all the leaves are drawn, so you wouldn't know that it's foliage unless I painted it green and then added some sort of texture using watercolors. So really I think it's a really interesting approach to watercolors that I love, because I can rely on my ink lines to create the boundaries, the edges, and most of the structure. It's almost like a map, like a really nice map, and then I can come in and color inside of it like a coloring book, but then I'm also able to take my paint and add texture and details as well. So there's detail in the ink lines and then there's detail in the watercolor, but not everything is hinging upon the watercolors, and I think that takes a lot of pressure off of it. I think it makes watercoloring more fun. It gives you the opportunity to paint a little bit more loosely. I don't like to color within the lines when I do this. I purposely will allow the paint to kind of bleed over or not be perfect, and I think that that's a really fun way to practice letting loose. I think a lot of people with watercolors, at least in my community and myself included, are trying to use watercolors in a way that trains us to loosen up. And watercolors really helps facilitate that, because of it's so, just the nature of it. It's so fluid. And I think by using it in a loose way, it helps us practice letting go. And I think that ink and wash is a great way to practice letting go. I mean, you can let go if it's just a watercolor painting, but there's also that sort of pressure when it's only a watercolor painting that it has to look like something, right? You have to be able to create the door and all the shadows and all the details all with watercolor paint, and that can be really tricky. But if you're doing ink and wash, you have these ink lines there, and they help you not have to do everything with watercolors, which I think is wonderful. And you can see here in this painting, I'm not inking in shadows, but I will be painting them with watercolor paint. So it goes back to what I said. Part of the detail is captured in ink lines, and then the other part is captured with watercolor. So they're sharing the burden, so to say. And so here you can see I'm just using my brush to dab in the darker areas of shadows, and it's being layered over the lightest areas of the wall. And so then that contrast and the little spots create the feeling of shadows. And I'm not being very, very detailed with it. So I'm not trying to be super realistic. I'm just taking what I see in the photograph, taking it as inspiration, and kind of leading me towards, oh, generally there's more shadow here. So I'm going to just make it a little bit more concentrated, my little dabbing. And then in some areas it's more sparse and maybe even lighter. So I'll dilute the color of my paint and I will skip around a little bit more. So it's not, like I said, it's not like I'm trying to create a photorealistic version of this photograph, but rather I'm just using it as inspiration. And so I think probably the hardest part of this painting is the shadow area. And so you can see how I approached it, which is kind of doing this basic background wash first with the lightest colors, and then I'm layering over the top of it with my shadow colors. And my shadow colors, my strategy here was really just to create shadows as darker versions of the colors that they're laying over. So to explain myself a little bit more, if I'm doing the shadows on the wall itself is like a creamy color, and the shadows on top of it are more of, they're like a darker version of the wall color. So in this case, it's like a brown or a shadowy brown color. And then when I get to the door, and the shadows that are on the door, they're kind of split, right? There's the shadows over the blue part of the door, and then there's shadows over the gray part of the door. So I just changed my colors. So the bottom part of the door, as you can see, I'm just using a darker version of the gray. That is the base of the door. So I'm not using the same shadow color over everything. I'm sort of changing the shadow color depending on what the color of the shadow is that's over the element. So that was my strategy, at least for this. That's just how I interpret it through my eyes, and you may see it totally differently. Maybe you see the shadows as all one color and you'll do it as one wash. But for me, I decided to separate it like this. So you can see over the door, I picked a darker blue, and then I just am using that to create the dappled shadows. And I'm going to layer a wash over the rest of the door to create the darker area. I don't know if, it's not very accurate, right? I think really the shadow colors could be better, I guess, if you were to say it like that. But I think this is just my own artistic interpretation of the shadows for this painting. And so maybe that would help you if I explained it like that, what I did, instead of you just watching it. So hopefully that is helpful. And here I am just finishing up the layers. So I really did do this in layers. And typically I would say when I do an ink and wash like this, I can actually do it really simply. So this is actually quite involved, is what I'm trying to say. It's a more involved watercolor painting over an ink and wash, because there's also the way that I do this in a sketchbook would be to do the ink lines and then do a really simple wash, so not spend quite as much time. This one I'm actually painting it on Arches pad paper, so it's like a nice watercolor paper, and so I can layer and spend more time. The paper will allow me to do that. But if you're doing this in a watercolor sketchbook, you may find that you don't have the ability to keep working the paper like I'm doing right now. Perhaps your washes are going to be a lot quicker, looser, and that's also really beautiful. I actually really love approaching it that way. So going back to the painting here, as you can see, I did that initial wash, like I said. So everything is very kind of one dimensional. And then I started layering on top of it. So I layered the shadows. I kind of layered some dry brush over the ground tile. And now I'm layering over the foliage with detail. So I'm using a smaller brush. I'm using a darker color. And then it's not extremely dark, but it's a darker version of what I was using before. And then I'm starting to dab in little details like the edges of the foliage, and then just hinting at the fact that there are maybe vines and small leaves. And so that's sort of how I approach something like this. So I will do a wash and then I will layer over it. So I think that, like I said before, just to call this out in case it's hard to see or you didn't see it before, was I didn't ink any of the foliage, and I'm really relying on the watercolors here to create that texture and detail. So it really does go hand in hand. The ink helps me provide some of the detail, and then the watercolor helps me provide the other parts of detail. So I think it's a really nice blend, and this I really do love this style because of that. So I wanted to say that there's a workaround here that I talked about with some of my members on a call, and then we did an exercise this way. Was, this color that I used in the very back, I should have addressed this at the beginning of the video, but there's a color called Buff Titanium, and I don't think it's a normal color to have. It's like an off-white, which, I really do recommend it. It's a really nice color. But if you don't have it, it's kind of hard to mix up a creamy white without, having if you have like a sienna or an ochre color, then that would work mixed with a little bit of white, because Buff Titanium is a little bit opaque because it has white in it. But if you don't have it, hopefully you can see from this point in the video that if I had not painted any of the Buff Titanium at all, and I just left it the white of the paper, it would still be successful. So here's an option, is you could try this without, and this is a really fun way I like to challenge myself with ink and wash, is I will leave big parts of the painting just the white of the paper for fun. So even though the wall itself, like the highlighted light parts of the wall, the lightest parts of the wall is what I'm trying to say, even though that is painted as Buff Titanium right now, if you took the very lightest parts of your picture and then just allowed it to be the white of the paper, you could just paint the shadows around it, if that makes sense. And that's also a really beautiful look. So that's an option for you if you don't have Buff Titanium or don't quite know how to mix up that creamy white color. If you're going to try this, try leaving the white of that wall, the lightest part of the wall, just the white of the paper, and then do everything else. You can still layer over it with a shadow color, like that darker brown color, and then proceed with the rest of it. Proceed with your blues, your grays, and your greens, and everything like that. What I like to do at the very end is to add, and this goes back to the foliage, the same idea. I'm adding in a couple of details I could have drawn with pen, but I chose not to. So the little really light hints of they're not slats, but there's definitely like a linear element to the door, if you can see it in the photograph. I'm adding those in with watercolor paint rather than drawing them in with a pen. So it's just another example of the fact that you can blend the two. So hopefully this was helpful and you enjoyed watching it. And let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And as always, all of the supplies and colors that I used are shared in the description.